People who have watched my previous videos will know that I tend to name drop the Dishonored games along with a few other immersive sims quite often, and there's a very good reason for it. No other type of genre allows the amount of freedom where players get to choose how to approach any given obstacle. These games typically don't feel like they have designed encounters or puzzles with a single solution. They try to build realistic seeming worlds and populate them with characters that go about their days in believable routines. Yeah, characters will have set behaviors and patrol routes because there's no getting away from the fact that this is still a video game and therefore it needs some kind of looping routine that idles away indefinitely, if you don't want to put players under the pressure of a time limit. But their level and mission design are usually still leagues above what other games present to their players in terms of scope. Unfortunately, it took me quite a while to actually get into immersive sims because a lot of them were often talked about in the context of stealth. My own personal experiences with stealth gameplay always stemmed from games in other genres not centered primarily on stealth, but which tended to feature mandatory stealth sections. And those were typically the low point of any game, so for the longest time I just thought I didn't like stealth as a concept. That all changed when I started playing games like the recent Deus Ex titles, which featured stealth gameplay that wasn't just trial and error with one specific solution to any given problem. Unfortunately, I still put off playing the Dishonored games until earlier this year because I was still under the impression that they're just regular stealth games. Once I started playing Dishonored, I quickly followed it up with its DLC missions and Dishonored 2, and I really enjoyed my time with these games immensely. It's hard to articulate my dismay about having waited for so long to actually play these fantastic games. But while I do have plenty of praise for the Dishonored games, I did have a few things to criticize regarding the previous titles. One aspect was that for all the lore and world building going on in these games, the narratives never really managed to draw me in. The characters were well written and their conversations are acted competently, but they're too utilitarian in nature to make me feel invested in this world. The first game suffered greatly in this regard because the narrative was just something that happened between missions and not even involved the protagonist. The second game managed to improve that somewhat, but it still felt like the weakest part of the game overall, and that's a real shame. The developers and writers clearly put a lot of thought into the backstory and world of this franchise, and there are entire novels and comics based on this universe to flesh it out. But the narrative and setting in these games just feel like it's largely a backdrop for the gameplay to happen in. You never get intimately familiar with characters because they tend to only ever talk about the task at hand. And while the games feature plenty of environmental storytelling, it never amounts to much by the end, so if you also end up reading all the notes and books strewn around, it's not like that pays off all that much. Another thing I wasn't a big fan of were the RPG mechanics. I felt that collecting runes and bone charms for their own sake wasn't all that interesting. Runes, which were used to unlock and upgrade abilities, quickly lost their luster because a couple of missions in I had plenty of runes to unlock all the powers I needed to get through the game. Similarly, the bone charms, which are swappable perks that grant you minor advantages, sometimes coupled with certain disadvantages, never seemed substantial enough for me to spend too much time with them. Never mind the crafting system that let you make additional bone charms. I never spent any time on that either because the games never really told me why I should even care. I still tried to collect most of the stuff simply because I enjoyed the level exploration, which felt like enough of a reward that I wasn't too disappointed whenever the loot at the end was just a rune or a bone charm. So let's see if Dishonored, Death of the Outsider manages to address some of these complaints. First things first, the game, just like its predecessors, excels at open world exploration gameplay. Just like the base game, Death of the Outsider features excellently designed maps that offer plenty of ways to traverse them in any way you like. The limitations in budget for this expansion are somewhat noticeable given the fact that 2 missions are set in the exact same map and 1 level takes place in an altered map from Dishonored 2. But it makes narrative sense for you to revisit this place, so I'll let it slide. Besides, the changes to the map ensure that you can't just use the same infiltration methods from the base game, so it's largely a wholly new experience either way. I guess on the gameplay front I could say that Death of the Outsider is just more of the same. And I would if that wouldn't come off as derisive rather than the praise it's intended to be. Because make no mistake, more of the same excellent and polished gameplay is always welcome. I could play this type of game forever and not get tired of it. There are some minor tweaks to the gameplay though. Once you acquire the magic powers after the first mission, you're basically set for the entire rest of the game. There's no need to hunt for runes and unlock new abilities, which is something I would have wished for in the previous games as well. The power set is also stripped down a bit, but I feel like it's been refined into what's actually necessary without any pointless fluff. The classic short-range teleport ability, which is called Displace in Death of the Outsider, is now not just useful to zip around the place and reach ledges above you to sneak over all the enemies. You can also set a marker as a target to teleport to, walk around the level, and if you have line of sight with the previously placed marker, you can teleport to that spot. This is especially useful in conjunction with the Foresight ability. This ability stops time and allows you to explore the level in spectral form, traveling through vents and mark up to 4 objects or enemies that then appear highlighted even through walls. And since you can travel through spaces that would otherwise be too small or narrow to fit through, you can then place a teleportation target on the other side of a fence or something similar, and when you have line of sight through that fence, you can then teleport through it. And these small entrances to places aren't always made obvious, so taking your time and thoroughly exploring your surroundings is highly encouraged. Speaking of marking enemies to make them visible, I really like this implementation a lot. The previous titles all had some kind of mechanic that let you see every single enemy within a certain range, which was such a useful power that it made little sense to ever not use it. It's the old Batman Arkham Asylum problem where if you have the ability to see every enemy through walls, why would you ever choose not to do that? The ability in previous games also used up so little mana that it hardly mattered because that little bit of mana always recovered on its own. So it's a free power that grants you a huge boon and it was up to the player to restrict themselves or not. Granted, you can still use the Foresight ability for free in Death of the Outsider in the sense that mana now recovers automatically for the entire mana bar as opposed to only a fifth in the previous games, so you no longer have to hunt around for elixirs to be able to use abilities. This was always a tightrope act that the Dishonored games had to walk. They gave you all these cool powers but limited their usefulness in some way. The aforementioned Bat Vision as well as the teleportation ability always used very little mana that recovered automatically. So you always had a handful of abilities that you could use indefinitely, but the other ones often felt like they consumed too much mana that had to be recovered manually to ever make liberal use of them. Death of the Outsider changes this for the better by making mana a constantly regenerating resource. You still can't just spam these abilities over and over again, there is a cooldown on regeneration. But it allows for a more free-form flow, so you don't have to be mindful of how many elixirs you have to fill up your mana in case you had to use one of the more expensive abilities. But since you now no longer have to hunt for runes to upgrade your powers and elixirs to maintain your mana, what else is there to do in Death of the Outsider? Well, this is where the contracts come into play. Most of the levels feature some kind of black market where you can purchase items, and close by is a little notice board where you can get a handful of additional missions in each level. I think this is a much better way of providing additional content to players and an incentive to explore these maps rather than having them hunt for upgrade points. You can still search for bone charms, but again, their use in my estimation is so limited that it's hardly an enticing offer. The contracts are much more interesting to do than just hunting for collectibles, but there is one aspect about them that I don't really like. Certain contracts explicitly state that you have to kill a target. There's no non-lethal way to complete a few of these contracts, so if you really want to complete them all, you'll have to kill someone. I like to play these games as non-lethally as possible, even reloading saves whenever I kill someone unintentionally. And the previous games all gave you options to deal with people in a non-lethal way. Heck, even the title of this game is a lie, because you don't actually have to kill the outsider at the end. There is an alternative where he gets to live. I mean, I'm not too bothered by the fact that you can't complete all the contracts in a non-lethal playthrough. You can just choose to ignore them like I did. But it still somewhat rubs me the wrong way that Arcane didn't invest the time and resources to give you non-lethal options for these side quests. Outside of that, there isn't much to complain about regarding the gameplay. The chaos system is absent here, so there are no consequences for playing the game as violently as you want, but since I played the previous games as stealthily and non-lethally as possible, I didn't get to experience any changes on that front. The narrative brings some closure to 3 of the characters that have appeared previously, but it's still mostly the least interesting part of the game. And aesthetically, the game largely follows the example set by Dishonored 2, so it's a stylized and still pretty to look at game despite being a couple of years old now. Overall, Death of the Outsider isn't a massive departure from what the base game already was. For most other games, I'd count that as a negative, but honestly, what's here from the previous games was already so polished that more of the same is more than enough to keep me coming back to it. If it's not been made clear yet, I certainly recommend Death of the Outsider just as much as I'd recommend any other entry in this series. They're all very much worth playing.